Yeah, I think that I think their focus has been far, or as far as I can see from what I see in the European mainstream media and the sort of the opinion formers, but they're making a number of mistakes. But probably one of the most important ones is to not be in a position or not try to analyze the balance of power. Now, I wrote an article about this. I think it was published in New European or something like that. I'll let you know for those who might want to read it. But in it, I said that the balance of power overwhelmingly favor Russia, and the Russia the point about the article though, was that it actually explicitly focused on what were the key determinants of the balance of power. And in that, I wrote about two things. I wrote about energy and I wrote about industry, and that those two put together what allows the nation to be powerful. And this was explicitly mentioned by Admiral Yamamoto at the start before the start of the Second World War, where he said, I won't get the quote quite right. He said that anybody who's seen the oil fields of Texas and the factories of Ohio will know that we can never win a long-term war against America. The article was focused on the Russia-Ukraine war, but I think it's equally true of America's balance of power with China and Russia. And I think when you look at it through that lens, you start to see that America is no longer in a position to dominate. So I think that the key factors are, as you say, they have exhausted huge amounts of money, as indeed has the rest of the West, in interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now the Russia-Ukraine war, for very little obvious benefit. But also there has been something else going on, which is the deindustrialization. And I put that down to the Chicago School of Economists, who leave everything to the market. And so what happens is that the market takes companies and industries abroad, particularly to China, where things are cheaper. And as a result of that, we're now in a position of 20 years of deindustrialization, which means that America is now in a position where even if it wanted to take on a hegemonic role, it doesn't have the power to do. Money goes with that, of course, but I think that's it's money and the fact that America is now deindustrialized, or no, not completely. It's a lot more industrialized than other areas. But we know that Russia has out industrialized in this war the whole of Europe and America put together, and is continuing so to do. So I think there's a tacit recognition in the document that actually hegemony is no longer possible, even if they wanted it. I happen to think it's not a good idea either. So there's a tacit recognition that actually we're into a tripolar world. As regards the Europeans, I just see no sign of them getting this yet. And it's difficult to understand why, other than they seem to have seduced themselves completely in a political narrative. I've said many months ago, I think it was about a year and a half ago, in a podcast with Danny Davis, that European and NATO operations in the Russia-Ukraine war are being driven by a political narrative, and the Russians by military strategy. And surprise, surprise, the military strategy is winning out. And it's a sort of solid military strategy, which, I have the greatest respect for because it is winning. But unfortunately, we seem to have what I can best describe as cult thinking amongst the European elites. And it's not just the politicians. I've seen it in military officers, I've seen it in intelligence officers, and it's almost as if they're captured in the cult. And the problem with cults is that when something happens, or the problem with cult thinking is that when something happens which goes against the narrative, then you try to rationalize it in a way which makes sense of the narrative, as opposed to looking at it as an opportunity to say, perhaps we've got this wrong. And I see no sign yet of Europe thinking it's got it wrong. I think wasn't it Schopenhauer who said truth has three stages. The first is that it's ridiculed. The second is that it's violently opposed. And the third is it's taken as self-evident. And I think America now tacitly takes the truth of the Russia-Ukraine war as self-evident, whereas Europeans are, or European leaders are violently opposing it, notwithstanding the fact that it's obvious and has been obvious to people like you and me and John Mearsheimer and Scott Bredler and Doug McGregor and Daniel Davis that actually this was a lost war 2 years ago, and there's even more of a lost war now. So no, I don't think Europeans get this yet. When they do get it, they're going to face a very unpalatable situation, which is either coming clean and saying that we've got this wrong, and that we need to work out how we're going to work as Europeans, or just trying to double down and hope, which so far is what they're doing.
Yeah, this is well, a problem with ideology, I think, as well, because ideology has some positive purposes. That is, it creates conformity around some common shared truths. That is, ideas we all subscribe to. But the problem is with ideology, when the reality change on the ground, there's then often less flexibility to adjust to new realities, and this is unfortunate for us, though, because openness has been, one of the strengths of Western civilization. That is, that you're open, you recognize the situation as it is, you're able um, to see mistakes, can correct, adjust away from the former weaker position. But it feels like we locked ourselves really into this, as you said. As soon as there's any evidence coming forth that contradicts this, the main assumption is that this is an attack, not just on our not just on the narrative, but our entire reality, and indeed who we are, how we view ourselves in this world. Especially for the EU, who sees them almost as having some divine function in their world to transition from the chaotic world of the past to some new liberal democratic order. I mean, this is how they define the foreign policy as well. We're going to change the world, make it more liberal, democratic, essentially reinvent the world in their own image. So for them to change course, it's very difficult, because you have to then change their identity, the foundation for their common policy and their entire shared truths. I mean, it's a lot to ask. So I can understand why they're so stubborn, but yes.
I think what they might have missed is that they're now fighting a war on two fronts, Glenn. They're fighting a war against they and NATO's and the NATO-Ukraine war, but they're fighting a war now with the Americans, because it's explicitly, and this is not European nations, but rather the EU and they talk about other transnational organizations. But the Americans have explicitly come out against those other transnational organizations in this document. So what they're actually saying is that actually we believe that one of the key problems of Europe is in those institutions, and I suspect that's a message which will land quite well with quite a lot of the European population. A lot of it won't, but I would imagine a significant portion of the European populations will think that. I mean, when Britain sort of came out of Europe, I voted for Brexit, and I voted it for structural reasons, because I could see that it was likely to be unsustainable in the medium to long term. I thought that I could see that actually you couldn't have a European superstate if you didn't have complete control of fiscal and monetary policy. And that's impossible unless you do have a single organization in charge. And the second thing I felt was that the euro was also likely to be unsustainable. And if you look at the euro now, what are called the target two imbalances between the northern nations, who are the wealthier nations, and the southern nations, as far as I can see, the debts therein are unrepayable. So it seemed to me that as soon as things started to come under pressure economically, and that Germany started to run short of money, Germany is the major banker, then actually the Germans would start to think that it really wasn't worth their while continuing within the European Union. And then actually quite a few other nations would see that if there was no value in terms of investment from the northern nations, who would be sort of drawing back, then they too would start to question the utility of the European Union. So I think the European Union is in deep trouble now, and I don't see a way out of it for the European Union. I think a lot of it's self-imposed, frankly. I mean, the policies in the Russia-Ukraine war have only intensified this, in as much as they've championed sanctions on energy, which, speaking as somebody who works in the energy industry, were always likely to be boomerang sanctions. They're doing much more damage to Europe than they are to Russia. And yet everybody seems to be looking to see if Russia will eventually collapse, as I think we get into the 19th round of sanctions. So to me, I think that sooner or later that the Germans are going to begin to question how much they continue to want to pay for into the European Union, and so will the other in-paying nations, such as Holland and so on. and that at that stage, then the utility will start to be under question. I think there's an open question as well about NATO, but we can perhaps come back to that in a second. So I think it's about time that the European Union actually started to think to itself: we're fighting a war which the Russians think is existential, and we know isn't existential. On the one hand, against the Russians, but we also now have an opponent, political opponents on the other side of the Atlantic. And whereas the neocons and the Make America Great Again, the different parts of the constituents on the Americans may disagree on what should be done about Russia-Ukraine war, I suspect they're all completely agreed about the European Union. So the European Union is now in the crosshairs of America, and not in the greatest of shape of relationships with Russia either.